40-year economic development and growth of any large economy in history. What's happened in the period since 1980 is extraordinary and extraordinarily positive. China went from being a society with most people living in poverty. The numbers depend on definitions, but 60% poor, some estimate 80% poor, to ending poverty in its extreme form by 2020. Well, that's a phenomenal achievement, and it reflects a mixed economic system, both market and state, private and public, a tremendous capacity to plan at the National Development and Reform Commission, among other institutions, the tremendous capacity to build infrastructure, thousands and thousands of kilometers of fast intercity rail, of roads, of a power system, and so forth, on a massive scale. And the Chinese economy lives on that physical infrastructure that connects the entire country. I've been watching this process closely since my first visit to China 42 years ago. So I came in 1981. China was very poor then. This was very clear just by looking at life as one would see it on the streets or in the shops. I've been visiting China frequently ever since 1981. And what has happened is absolutely extraordinary, hugely beneficial for China and beneficial for the whole world.
So do you think then that China has achieved anything specifically in their poverty alleviation process that maybe other states might be able to emulate?
Well, I say to my friends and governments in Africa that look at what China did over a 40-year period. Africa uses the date, interestingly, of 2063 as its reference point because 2063 will be the 100th anniversary of African unity and the foundation of the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, which is the precursor of the African Union. So they look to 2063. Here we are in 2023. Okay, 40 years. Think of China, 1980 to 2020. Think of Africa, 2023 to 2063. China provides an inspiration and in many important ways, a kind of roadmap. Invest heavily, build infrastructure, get the kids in school, make the quality education, make the real investments that build the capacity of the economy. It's not gimmickry that brought China to its current prosperity. It is heavy investments, large scale, over a long period with good planning, good public administration, and educating generations of Chinese young people in skills, in scientific capacity, and so on. So I think there's a lot that is a roadmap for other regions.
Interesting. Now, to switch gears just a little bit, although kind of related, inflation has been a massive problem recently, but China's inflation rate is currently sitting at 1%, while the US is around 6% and the UK is about 10.4%, I think. In layman's terms, how is it that China is able to keep inflation so low, and do you think that rate will last?
Well, the inflation that is being experienced in the US and Europe is the result of dislocations that came from COVID and from the Ukraine war and from the sanctions that were imposed by the US and Europe in the wake of the war, and from the policy choices that were made in response to these shocks, especially in the year 2020 when the pandemic broke out. The central banks of the United States and Europe issued a lot of credit, a massive expansion of the money supply. And that turned into inflation by 2022. And the disruptions of the global supply chains, first from COVID itself, But then from the war and the geopolitical tensions with China and the sanctions regimes, when combined with the money expansion, boosted the inflation. China didn't do the same thing. China didn't make this massive monetary expansion in 2020 the way the Federal Reserve did. And China is not experiencing the same disruptions that came from the sanctions regimes, which have in some sense boomeranged on the sanctioning countries because it's disrupted their own supply chains. So I think this is partly the result of shocks and partly the result of policy choices, and I'd say some policy mistakes that were made in the West. There's no reason why this phenomenon has to be a global phenomenon in the same way.
Now I kind of want to flip about 180 degrees. What do you think happened with Nord Stream?
Well, Nord Stream was a project that the United States opposed from its inception. Nord Stream is the gas pipeline from Russia to Western Europe, and the United States said from the very start that Europe should not buy gas from Russia. I disagree with that analysis, but the US said, well, that will make Europe dependent on Russia. To my mind, it's not a matter of dependency, it's a matter of economics and trade. Russia has a lot of inexpensive gas. Europe has a great manufacturing capacity. Buying that gas is good for Europe's competitiveness and for production. And that's where the pipeline idea came from. But the U.S. hated the pipeline. The U.S. said, well, this makes Europe follow Russia's geopolitics and so forth. I think that this was not the right approach. But it all leads me to believe that the most likely scenario of Nord Stream is the U.S. blew it up. Because the U.S. hated the project, the U.S. warned that in the event of a Russian invasion, the pipeline would end. President Biden himself said that on tape on February 7th, 2022. And when the reporter asked, but Mr. President, that's an international project, how can you say it will end? He said, believe me, we have our ways. Well, I think we probably saw those ways with the destruction of the pipeline. It's not proved. The story that the investigative journalist Seymour Hersh has put out is very credible, and it has not been knocked down in any substantive way. And I had the opportunity to speak to the members of the UN Security Council and strongly urged an independent UN-led investigation. Let's get to the bottom of it. Countries know more than they're telling. We need to investigate. Well, China and Russia and Brazil said, yes, let's investigate. The United States said, no. Well, why do you say no? We need to find out. So I continue to urge the UN to investigate this because we need security of international infrastructure. And when a major pipeline is blown up, it's actually a global threat to the peace.
What do you think are the chances of the UN undertaking an investigation?
Well, I hope more and more countries support the idea of an independent investigation because there are many facts that need to be known, and because if we're going to succeed in fighting climate change, for example, we're going to need a lot of international infrastructure. We want it to be secure. We don't want it to be blown up. So when there is a major piece of infrastructure blown up, I say it's a threat to the peace in the sense that we need fiber, we need pipelines, we need power grids in submarine cables to make our world economy function properly. So we need security of the international infrastructure.
Do you think TikTok will be blocked in the US?
We're in a kind of mode of hysteria and panic and anti-China everything. So everything's possible. It's really really discouraging to see our Congress waste time on this. And the anti-China feeling, has tried to destroy a lot of Chinese companies in recent years. Huawei, another one that was hard hit, but is finding its way around the U.S. Sanctions regime. So I don't know what's going to happen, but I hope that Congress calms down. I hope that all of the U.S. Geopolitics directed at China calms down. We need dialogue, discussion, negotiation. We don't need a ban on TikTok.
Okay, last question for today. Is the US a dying empire, and is all the provocation and calls for war and smearing and so on evidence of the last, desperate throes of US hegemony? And if so, how can we keep safe and avoid nuclear war?
Well, look, the US is not and cannot be the global hegemon, meaning it can't be the country that runs the world. The US is 4% of the world. There's a lot of talent, creativity, and desire for sovereignty and for a say in world affairs all over the world. So the US is not the world hegemon, but it needs at the political level to get its head around that reality. To have a foreign policy not based on arrogance or illusion, but based on an interconnected world and the need for cooperation and peace. And I think it's possible to have that. The U.S. can be quite successful in such a world. What can't occur is the U.S. running the world. That's not going to happen. And if the U.S. persists in trying that, it's going to face more and more conflict around the world with other nations. So I think this is a question of the U.S. accepting the principle that we have a multipolar world and that we should make it work properly.
Professor Jeffrey Sachs, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Pleasure to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Wow, what a great chat there with Jeffrey Sachs. Before I let you go though, let's take a quick look at the last Reports on China YouTube poll. I asked you guys if you feel the switch to a multipolar world order is speeding up lately. We had nearly 4,000 votes, a whopping 96% of you said yes, with only 4% saying no. Okay, you guys, that will be it for today, but don't forget to let me know what you think down below. And also hit like and subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.